Hello my dear friends, you're on the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 1st of November of 2023. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. But before we start discussing the situation on the ground, I would like to tell you that some updates from Kiev. And as you know, the President Zelensky has a lot of problems, has lots of political problems, and there is a very big and powerful political crisis in Ukraine. As you know, Zelensky reported that nobody believes in Ukrainian victory like he does, and nobody. So he has a lot of problems. People in Ukraine are tired from this war, and more people, more and more different men started saying that they're going to try to become a president of Ukraine the next year. Obviously, Zelensky will try to become a president one more time. Also, we know that some sources are saying that Zaluzhny, the head of the Ukraine army, also planning to become a president, and there is another very famous Ukrainian blogger, Arestovich, who is also planning to become a president for the next 4-year term. A lot of people, I understand, can do this, and Zelensky, of course, wants to stay president himself, but there is one problem for Ukraine and one problem for Russia. No matter who is going to become a president, nobody is going to stop war with the Russians. Even Arestovich, the most pro-peaceful candidate, told us that he's not going to end this war, but he's going to start the conflict. He's going to go into complete defense and not to attack anymore. Furthermore, for example, Arestovich reported that Ukraine will try to ask NATO to become a partner, to become a part of NATO, but with obligations that Ukrainians are not going to force NATO to fight for these territories, for Donbass, Lugansk, Kherson, and he will make an obligations, Ukraine will make an obligations in the face of NATO, that Ukrainians will try to return these territories just with political ways. So nobody is going to stop this war, no matter who is going to become the next president. But when talking about Europe, we know that currently Europe is very tired of Ukraine. And for example, today the Russian bloggers and prankers called the Prime Minister of Italy, Meloni, and they represented themselves at some European authorities, and they were talking about the situation in the world, about the situation in Ukraine, and Meloni reported and told those guys that Ukrainians, that European leaders got tired from Ukraine, and of course they want to change the entire situation. So the Ukrainians have a very powerful, big political crisis that can lead to, of course, much more worse situation that we can see right now. When talking about the situation on the ground, we got a lot of details, a lot of updates, and first let's start with Kupyansk direction. The Minister of Defense of Russian Federation reported that as a result of clashes on Kupyansk direction, the Ukrainians lost 245 soldiers, 2 armored vehicles, and 6 artillery systems. And as we see, the Russians continue suppressing and the Ukrainian artillery forces, trying to establish complete artillery superiority. And of course, we understand that the main reason of these artillery duels is to force the Ukrainian artillery forces to move further in direction of Oskol River. And for example, on this video we can see another Russian attempt to attack, and we discussed this video in the previous update. Just one more time, let's take a look at these scenes. The Russians were attacking. This video was provided us by the Ukrainian sources, which means that we're not going to see the Russian victories or something like this. Of course, they will try to publish as much as possible losses among the Russians, but if we will return back to the map, we're going to see that the Russians started movement somewhere in Pershatravneva. They reached this first geolocated position, then they start moving to the south along the tree lines, along the brushes, and this is the final area of Russian geolocation. So on the south of Pershatravneva, and they're currently, the Russians trying to develop their positions on this area. They're trying to dig in deeper, and the next phase, the next stage of the Russian offensive operation is to clear the trenches and to cut physically the road that connects Kupyansk and Orlyanka. And this will allow the Russians to encircle, or at least to half encircle, the Ukrainian positions in Kislovka, Kotlerovka, Stepova, Novoselka, Ivanovka from the north. And during the day, we got more details, more updates from this area. Another Russian offensive operation took place between between Yahidna and Ivanovka. And the Russians, so this offensive operation, this video was published by the Russian sources, so that's why we're gonna see more interesting like updates, details, more successful ones. On this video we see another Russian attempt to attack. As you can see, also significant number of armored vehicles, tanks. The Russian infantry managed to land along the tree lines, and the Russians started clearing the trenches very fast. As you can see, there are no like artillery counterattacks from the Ukrainian side, maybe because most of their artillery systems were suppressed by the Russian artillery systems. And at some point, at some minute of these clashes, the Ukrainians realized that there are no chances to survive, there are no chances to hold this territory, and basically the Ukrainians started running away. They're running away very fast, even maybe faster than tanks or armored vehicles. So basically the Ukrainians left these positions without even a fight or battles. So as a result of clashes in front of Ivanovka, probably the Russians managed to restore control over this position for another time. So now we will update this map. And currently we see that as a result of clashes during the previous 24 hours, the Russians conducted two attacks, one from the north and the second one from the east in direction of Ivanovka. So if we increase the global scope, we understand the main goal and the main Russian plans to attack Stepovna and Vasylovka at least from two global directions, from the north, and the second one is from the east. This is the main Russian target, this is the main Russian goal, to establish control over this small village. And if the Russians are able to do this and to dig in deeper, they will be able to do the most important thing. They will be able to cut the main supply roads that goes in direction of Kislovka-Kotlarovka. So the road N26 and the railways that goes from Kupyansk to Kislovka-Kotlarovka as well. So this is the Russian plans, and as you can see, during the previous 24 hours, the Russians managed to achieve some success and some results. So we'll follow the situation, because as I understand, tomorrow we're going to see more updates and more clashes on this direction, because now the Russians are trying to dig in deeper on new positions, and obviously the Ukrainians will counterattack. As we discussed, to conduct this operation successfully, the Russians were suppressing the Ukrainian artillery forces. On this evening, on this video, we see how the Russians managed to discover the United Kingdom artillery system AS-90, and as a result of Lancet strike, that artillery system was destroyed. And this is like one episode of counter-artillery duels. Another very interesting video is coming from Oskol River. The Ukrainians managed to restore the pontoon bridges in this area that were destroyed in September and August, but the Russians, of course, the Russians allowed the Ukrainians to restore bridge, but when time came, the Russians destroyed this bridge one more time, probably with missile H-37. So everything is very simple. The Russians launched attack, and the thing that they should do, and they did, is to cut supply roads, rotation roads, and not allow the Ukrainians to bring operational reserves in this area. And that was like the mission, that was the operation, and as you can see, the Russians were pretty successful. Now we're moving to Liman direction, and we got also very interesting details and updates from this territory. The Minister of Defense of Russian Federation reported that as a result of clashes in this area, the Ukrainians lost 200 soldiers, 3 armored vehicles, and 1 artillery system. And as you can see, the level of losses on Liman front line are also very heavy, very heavy. For example, yesterday the level of losses were 250 soldiers. Today the Ukrainians lost 200 soldiers, so 1 battalion just for 2 days. This is, I don't remember such a heavy losses ever on this direction. There was one day once the Ukrainians had losses of 485 soldiers, and now the thing that we can see right now, of course, another Russian attempt to penetrate the Ukrainian defense belt. So as you can see, according to geolocations, according to this video, the Russians were bombing the Ukrainian positions on the line between Makiivka, Nevskaya, Makiivka, next Novosadova, Terny. And the most important thing, that the Russians were bombing not just the buildings, not just the Ukrainian trenches. The Russians mainly were focused on supply roads. As you can see, there is a river Zheribets, there are lots of water reservoirs and lakes, and there are lots of supply roads, very tiny ways, supply lines that Ukrainians need to pass to bring some reserves, reinforcement on the Russian side of Zheribets river. And most of those supply roads were under very heavy fire during the previous 24 hours. We understand that the Russians currently are trying to storm the Ukrainian forces in Makiivka, And the Russians are using the same tactics as they were using in Kupyansk. First of all, they destroyed and attack and pin down or freeze or whatever the main supply roads, and after that they launched another attack in Makiivka. And while the Ukrainians were trying to find a solution how to bypass their force, how to transfer, how to redeploy their forces from one side to another and not being attacked from the Russians, they waste some time, the pressure time, that the Russians used for another wave of attack in direction of Makiivka. Obviously, tomorrow we're gonna receive some updates, some details from the battle of Liman, because today we got just these like bombardments of the main supply traffic in this area. Now we're moving further to Siversk. We haven't received anything from this direction. The same story about Bahmut, Artyomovsk, just regular clashes, Lancet strikes against the Ukrainian armored vehicles, artillery systems. On this video we can see another artillery system destroyed by the result of Lancet strike. A little bit to the south in direction of Chasov Yar, the Russians destroyed Ukrainian radar on this small construction, with also with Lancet strike, with new type of Lancet strike with AI navigation. As you can see, the Lancet managed to capture, discover and recognize the target, and then there are going to be no problems to destroy it. And now we are moving to Avdiivka area. The Russians reported that as a result of clashes on the Donetsk direction, the Ukrainians lost 245 soldiers, 6 armored vehicles, 3 tanks, including 1 Leo. The Leo losses we discussed yesterday. If you remember, Leo arrived 2 days ago. Yesterday he was destroyed. And 2 artillery system D-30. This is a very important day about Avdiivka. Of course, there were no updates on the ground. The Russians haven't managed to capture new territories or something like this. At least maybe they managed, but we haven't received even a single geolocation about that. But starting of today, of the 1st of November, we start receiving the videos of destroyed Ukrainian armored vehicles. Because since 10th of October till, let's say, 31st of October, we've been receiving just the videos of destroyed Russian armored vehicles, like Russian tanks, Russian personal carriers, and today we receive like at least 4 armored vehicles were destroyed. On this video we can see at the beginning of the video the Leopard on the bottom, the Leopard that probably was included into the Ministry of Defense report, like just few meters to the top, the first Bradley that was also destroyed as a result of fire. We don't see infantry, maybe the Ukrainians managed to evacuate the infantry. Then the camera turns to the north and we're gonna see Stepova. So on the screen in front on the video we can see the village by the name of Stepova. This is the video, this is the village, this is Stepova, and we're gonna see another Bradley that was destroyed right in front of the building. This is the icon on the map, and further to the north along the railways we're gonna find another Bradley of the 47th Mechanized Brigade that was abandoned or damaged or destroyed as a result of clashes that took place on the 31st and the 1st of November. So as you can see, the Ukrainians start losing their vehicles along the railways. From one side, this video confirms that the Russians haven't managed to cross the area and haven't managed to establish like a 100% secured stronghold and positions on the Ukrainian side of the railways. But from the other side, we see that Ukrainians, to stop the Russian progress, to slow them down at least for some meters or seconds, they're sending more and more armored vehicles and they're losing them. 47th Mechanized Brigade has been destroyed and reduced till 0 probably for the 4th time since the creation of this small brigade. Very interesting video we got from the road between Novobakhmutovka and Krasnogorovka. The Ukrainian forces try to send some reconnaissance and sabotage groups behind the Russian main positions. On this video we can see a small tree line and we see a significant number of Ukrainian soldiers who are lying down on the ground on the surface waiting for orders, but the night vision equipment allowed the Russians to recognize the Ukrainian forces, and the Russians sent information to the artillery forces and the Russians started bombing this territory heavily. We don't know exact number of losses among the Ukrainian soldiers, but after the first strike the Ukrainians took a decision to run away. They created some kind of small road for withdraw their position, but as I understand the Russians didn't allow them to do this. And as the most important, there are a few things that we need to understand from this video. The first one is probably the map. The military summary version of this map doesn't correspond to the reality. As I understand, this territory, I will mark it with the gray cloud, probably is in the gray zone. And if we continue receiving such updates, we will update the map and we'll show this territory as a gray zone. So the Ukrainians, at least they have possibilities to send sabotage and reconnaissance team in this area with the purpose, with attempts to attack the Russian rear and to attack the Russian forces in their back while they're trying to storm the Ukrainian positions on the north of Avdiivka. When talking about southern direction, we got just few updates, and the most important ones are coming from Pervomaisk. On this video, we see how the Russians managed to discover the Ukrainian armored vehicle, and as a result of a few FPV drone strike, that armored vehicle or personal carrier or truck was destroyed. The truck is not important. The important is the concentration of Russian geolocations in this small village. If we zoom in, and if we increase the number of updates, let's say from the 1st of October, we're gonna see a significant number of Russian strikes in this area. All these strikes can have just one meaning. The Ukrainians try to concentrate their forces on this line, and they're very slowly, step by step, they're sending more and more soldiers. Currently, the Ukrainians try to concentrate their forces along every single tree line. It is a very difficult task. There are no armored vehicles, there are no tanks, just infantry, just light infantry. Every single building also is under Ukrainian control. And as soon as the Ukrainians are able to concentrate their critical mass, obviously I expect more attacks in the Russian flanks, in direction towards the Russian flanks, in direction of Piesky and Oputne. So this is the Ukrainian plan, and we need to expect this plan, the implementation of this plan very soon. As I understand, the Ukrainians realize and know the critical situation in Avdiivka, and they have just one thing left to do, not to allow the Russians to encircle this area completely. The Ukrainians need to restore control over these villages like Vadiane, Piesky and Oputne. And if the Ukrainians can do this, we can stop talking about any offensive operation towards Avdiivka, because this operation is going to have no sense without the southern foothold. And the Ukrainians understand this, and very soon they will try to counterattack, while the Russians are trying to dig in deeper. Now we are moving to the south direction. We got also updates. The Russians continue bombardments of Krasnogorovka. On this video, we see another strike against the concentration of Ukrainian forces. If you remember, recently the Russians managed to establish control over the area in the vicinity of the coal mine. The Russians managed to capture more tree lines. Currently, they are trying to dig in deeper. And of course, the Russians expect some counter-offensive operation from the Ukrainians. And that's why they try to bomb the city very heavily, with the purpose not to allow the Ukrainians to start counterattacking. When the time comes, of course, the Russians will stop, but then the Ukrainians will attack the impenetrable wall of the Russian forces on the south between the fortifications like coal mine Prudovskaya and this area. So currently the Russians, this is just one thing the Russians are trying to do. Also, we see another attempt of the Russian forces to attack Marinka. The Russians were bombing this village heavily. They tried to force the Ukrainians to step back, to withdraw their position, to clear the area, and this is another direction of Russian attack. Currently, we stopped receiving any updates from the southern part of Marinka, because that part was reduced to ruins, and the northern part on the north of this water reservoir still exists. There are still buildings where the Ukrainians can have their positions. And one more time, if we increase the number of updates since the beginning of October, we're gonna see the Russians are very focused in this area, and I believe that they will continue this focus at least until they manage to reduce this area till ruins as well. Maybe, or the Ukrainians leave this territory and the Russians will capture. But I don't think that the Ukrainians are going to step back. The Battle of Novomikhailivka we have already discussed. The Russians started artillery preparation. Probably this week we are going to see more attempts, or at least the first attempts of the Russian, reconnaissance in force or reconnaissance in combat, where the Russians will try to enter the village from the south, and if they are successful, of course, they will increase and continue the pressure. If not, they will withdraw, will step back and start everything from the beginning. I'm talking about Lemur missiles, about the guided bombs, and then they will start. So this week, obviously, we're gonna see first attempts of entering this village from the south. When talking about Vremivka tactical bridgehead, the Russians also restored and restarted their attacks. On this video, we see how the Ukrainians try to probably maybe to get something from the ruins as a result of strikes. The Russians destroyed this building. Maybe that was a warehouse. But when the Ukrainians concentrated some forces, the Russians made more attacks, and probably now the Ukrainian position was destroyed. So this is not the first case in this area. The Russians also published the video how they managed to discover and to destroy a supply machine that was moving from the mainland in direction of Staromayorsk. If you remember, during the previous 2-3 weeks, the Russians mainly were focused a little bit to the west from Novomayorsk, Staromayorsk, and the Russians were trying to develop their positions on the north of Priyutne. And as a result of clashes on Priyutne, on this direction, the Russians managed to improve their positions, to capture new tree lines, and as I understand, they managed to secure the flanks, and now the Russians are ready to start their offensive operation in Staromayorsk from the west. Maybe the Russians are planning to restore control over this village, but because the geolocations and activity in this area tells me that maybe they have such plans. When talking about South Donetsk direction, as a result of clashes on this area, the Ukrainians lost 190 soldiers, 8 armored vehicles. On Zaporizhzhia area, there are no changes. The Ukrainians continue their offensive operation, but during the previous days, the Ukrainians lost significant number of armored vehicles as a result of Russian Lancet strikes, artillery strikes, anti-tank missile strikes. More than 70 pieces of armored vehicles were destroyed for less than 1 week. And by the time the Ukrainians managed to concentrate some critical mass between Rabotin and Verbova, the Ukrainians lost every single armored vehicle. And during the previous 24 hours, the Ukrainians made few attempts to attack the Russian positions, but just with infantry, without any support of armored vehicles or tanks or personal carriers, just infantry between the fields, among the mines, and under very heavy Russian fire. Obviously, the Ukrainian attempt was repelled. The Ukrainians were completely defeated, and obviously they were forced to step back, because I don't see any chances to develop anything successful without any support of artillery, armored vehicles, or personal carriers. Now we're moving to Kherson direction, and the situation is getting worse and worse for the Russians in this area. I'm not saying that the situation is critical. No, the situation is not critical, but the Russians still haven't found a solution how to force the Ukrainians to step back from this area. The Russians haven't started any attempts to storm the Krinky, to try the Ukrainians to step back from this territory. The Russian military experts are saying that as a result of all these clashes during the previous few weeks, the Ukrainians managed to concentrate up to probably 2 campaigns in this area. So I'm not sure about the exact number of Ukrainian forces, but there are a lot of them, and the most important is not the number of forces. Obviously, the Russians have more forces in this area, but the problem is that the Russians can't counterattack. I'll explain to you. First of all, before we start discussing the Russian problems, the Russian sources published the video how the Ukrainians send their Marines on the Russian bank. So this video was made somewhere from Krinky, somewhere from the area of Krinky. As you can see, 3 very fast boats arrived on the Russian bank of the river. Probably some group of Ukrainians landed, and another part of Ukrainians got on boats and moved back on the Ukrainian side of the river. So as you can see, there is a very big traffic. We are not talking about 1 boat a day. We are talking at least 3 boats at the same time, or even more. So the Ukrainians don't have problems to send forces, but the Russians have problems to counterattack. And the main reason of that is the Ukrainian bank of the river is on the hill. And the Russian sources are saying that Ukrainians do have possibilities to attack the Russians in Krinky from Tyaginka with tanks. They don't need even artillery systems. They can enter the roads, go on roads, and to attack the Russian positions with tanks, because they're on the hill and they can see everything. And somehow to slow down the Ukrainians, to deal some damage to them or something like this, to solve this issue, the Russians continue bombardments of all these villages, Tyaginka, Ivanovka, Novotyaginka, Lvovo, with FABs, but as we can see, it doesn't help much. because if it helped, of course, we wouldn't see all this, we wouldn't receive all these updates regarding the Ukrainian foothold on the Russian bank of the river. You know that nobody believed that Ukrainians are able to do this, but now we see that Ukrainians not just managed to implement, but Ukrainians currently are able to hold, and there are no chances for the Russians to counterattack. At least for now, the Russians, after they changed the general and commander of this direction, the Russians put the first goal. They and the first goal and the first thing they need to do is to suppress completely the Ukrainian artillery forces. From one side, the Ukrainians attack the Russians from tanks, but of course the Ukrainians also use artillery forces, artillery systems. For example, during the previous 24 hours, the Russians published at least 2 videos how they managed to discover and to destroy the Ukrainian artillery positions that were attacking the Russians from hidden positions. This is the first artillery system that was destroyed by Lancet, and this is the second one. Both of them were destroyed with Lancet, and this is M777 howitzer. So after the Russians can suppress the Ukrainian artillery forces, they will try somehow to suppress the Ukrainian tank forces, and for this purpose the Russians can use the Russians don't need to use artillery force or Lancet to destroy the Ukrainian tanks. For example, in the vicinity of Antonovka, the Russians published the video how they were using just a regular anti-tank missile, anti-tank equipment. So basically the Russians do have possibilities to destroy Ukrainian tanks on their bank of the river with anti-tank missiles. There is no problem with this. The problem is to get very close and not to be discovered by the Ukrainian intelligence. And we know that there are a lot of drones in this area from the Ukrainian side. Also, the Russians reported that they managed to discover and destroy another Ukrainian radar in Kherson direction, and of course maybe that improved the Russian common position. And furthermore, the Ministry of Defense reported that as a result of clashes on Kherson direction, the Ukraine lost 80 soldiers, 4 armored vehicles, and 2 Su-27 aircrafts. And this is very important because the Ukrainians start losing significant number of aircrafts as Russians start using the new type of missile, like air-to-air one, and we see the results. At least when talking about the report. Of course, we don't have the numbers, we don't have the geolocated videos. I'm talking about real hit and explosion of aircraft, but mainly the explosions of aircrafts are taking place very far from the combat line. So that's why the Russians maybe don't have possibilities to make a video and to geolocate it or something like this. Also, very important updates are coming from the border with Belarus. The Russian sources are saying that Ukrainians concentrated up to 120,000 soldiers along the border with Belarus. I don't know what is the purpose of this army in this area, but who knows what the Ukrainians have in their minds, what Zelensky has in his mind, because as we discussed in the beginning of this video, maybe he is the only guy in Ukraine who believes in victory of Ukraine. Maybe he is the only one. And that's it for this video. Military Summary channel reminds we condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.